The grand piano was stained with the blood of 3 professional musicians by midnight. Ettore Sacco, the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld, demanded perfection, and failure was fatal. The room held its breath, waiting for the next victim, until a curvy maid quietly set down her silver tray. The penthouse crowning the Sacco Tower offered a panoramic view of a stormy Chicago skyline. But no one in the sprawling, dimly lit room dared to look at the window. All eyes were fixed on the center of the sunken living area, where a massive, custom-built black Steinway grand piano sat like a monolithic altar. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass, but the sound was entirely drowned out by the heavy, suffocating silence of absolute terror. Ettore Sacco sat in a high-backed leather armchair, swirling an amber liquid in a crystal glass. He was the head of the Sacco Syndicate, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency and cold-blooded violence had firmly established him as the apex predator of the Midwestern criminal underworld. He was a man composed of sharp angles, tailored Italian suits, and eyes as dark and unforgiving as the depths of Lake Michigan. Tonight was supposed to be a diplomatic gathering, a rare parley with the East Coast factions. Instead, it had devolved into a macabre theater of cruelty. Standing near Ettore, nursing a glass of champagne with a predatory smirk, was Regina Renner. As the heiress to the Renner cartel out of New York, Regina was all sharp edges, starved perfection, and venomous ambition. She'd come to Chicago to secure a permanent alliance with Ettore, hoping to merge their empires through a strategic marriage. She was accustomed to men bowing to her demands, but Ettore had barely acknowledged her presence, his attention consumed by the bizarre psychological game he was playing with the room. Ettore had issued a challenge. He had acquired a specific, hand-written sheet of music, an unpublished and impossibly complex piece composed by a madman who had died in a Venetian asylum a century ago. Ettore had offered a massive concession of the city's southern ports to anyone whose entourage could produce a pianist capable of playing the piece flawlessly on the first try. The catch, however, was severe. The penalty for failure was not just a lost deal. It was a brutal lesson in humility. 3 world-class virtuosos, flown in specifically by rival bosses hoping to win Ettore's favor, had already taken the bench. 3 times, the frantic, erratic tempo and physically demanding chords had proven too much. 3 times, Ettore had raised a single finger, and his guards had dragged the weeping musicians away, ensuring they would never play another note with their fractured hands. The blood on the pristine ivory keys was a glaring reminder of the stakes. Moving silently along the periphery of the room was Lucia Colombo. Dressed in the stark black and white uniform of the estate's staff, she was trying desperately to remain invisible. Lucia was a striking woman, possessing a soft, full, plus-sized figure that the rigid uniform could barely contain. Her curves were a stark contrast to the skeletal thinness of the high society women in the room, like Regina, and she usually kept her head bowed to avoid the leering gazes of the Mafia soldiers. But beneath her submissive exterior lay a deep, unbreakable resilience. Lucia had not always been a maid. Before her father had crossed the wrong loan sharks and vanished into the Chicago River, he had been a master instructor at the conservatory. He had taught Lucia everything, instilling in her a profound, almost instinctual understanding of music. She knew the piece sitting on Ettore's piano. She had learned it in the cramped, dusty apartment of her childhood. It was a piece designed not just for technical skill, but for raw, unbridled emotion. Listening to the arrogant, sterile professionals butcher it had been a unique kind of torture for her. As the third pianist's screams faded down the hallway, the tension in the penthouse reached a breaking point. The remaining mob bosses exchanged nervous, sweat-slicked glances. No one else was willing to step forward. The southern ports were a prize beyond measure, but not worth the wrath of Ettore Sacco. Ettore sighed, a soft, dangerous sound that echoed in the cavernous room. He set his glass down on a side table. He looked around the room with utter contempt, his gaze sweeping over the hardened killers and wealthy criminals who were now trembling in their bespoke shoes. Regina Renna laughed, a harsh, grating sound that shattered the silence. She stepped forward, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. She waved a dismissive hand at the piano and turned her piercing gaze to Ettore. She told him that this little parlor trick was growing tedious. She insisted that there was no one left in the room foolish enough to humor his sadistic tastes, and suggested they finally retire to his study to sign the alliance papers and discuss more intimate arrangements. She leaned in close, attempting to invade his personal space with a calculated display of dominance. Ettore did not flinch. He did not even look at her. His cold eyes were fixed on a spot near the back of the room. Lucia had been tasked with clearing the abandoned champagne flutes from a nearby table. Her hands were slightly unsteady, her heart pounding against her ribs as she listened to Regina's shrill voice. As she turned, her foot caught the edge of a thick Persian rug. She stumbled, and the silver tray tilted. A single crystal glass slipped and shattered violently against the marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot. Every eye in the room snapped to the Curvy Maid in the corner. Lucia froze, her breath catching in her throat. She instinctively dropped to her knees to gather the shards, her face burning with humiliation. Regina saw an opportunity to assert her superiority. She stalked over to Lucia, looking down at the kneeling woman with absolute disgust. Regina mocked her, calling her a clumsy, overweight cow who was unfit to serve in such a high-class establishment. Regina then looked back at Ettore, a cruel smile twisting her lips. She pointed at Lucia and joked that since the fat maid had ruined the atmosphere, perhaps she should be the one to take the master's challenge. Regina sneered that it would be entertaining to watch someone of her size try to move her fingers fast enough to play a single chord, let alone a masterpiece. The room erupted in nervous, sycophantic chuckles from Regina's men. But Ettore did not laugh. He slowly stood up from his leather chair. The sheer imposing mass of the man silenced the room instantly. He walked over to where Lucia was kneeling. The heavy thud of his footsteps made the floorboards vibrate. He stopped just inches from Regina, completely ignoring the cartel heiress, and looked down at Lucia. Ettore told Lucia to stand. His voice was a low, gravelly command that brooked no disobedience. Lucia carefully rose to her feet, clutching the silver tray against her chest like a shield. She finally met his gaze. Instead of the terrified, tear-filled eyes he expected, Ettore saw a flare of defiant fire. She was entirely unashamed of who she was, possessing a quiet dignity that immediately set his blood burning. The soft curve of her hips, the fullness of her lips, and the fierce intelligence in her eyes struck him with the force of a physical blow. Ettore gestured toward the bloody piano. He asked her, his tone devoid of its usual mocking cruelty, if she could play. Regina scoffed loudly, stepping between them to protest that it was just a joke, that a lowly maid could not possibly read music. But Ettore casually backhanded Regina across the face. The strike was sudden, brutal, and sent the thin heiress crashing to the floor with a split lip. The Renner cartel's guards instinctively reached for their weapons, but a dozen Sacco soldiers instantly drew their firearms, aiming directly at their heads. The room froze on the edge of an absolute bloodbath. Ettore didn't even look at the woman bleeding on his floor. He kept his dark, obsessive gaze locked entirely on Lucia. He repeated his question, his voice softening just a fraction, a sound no one in the Chicago syndicate had ever heard. Lucia looked at the piano. She looked at the blood on the keys, the sheet music waiting under the soft spotlight, and then back at the ruthless Mafia boss. She placed her tray on a nearby table. Without a word, she walked past the stunned crowd, her full hips swaying with a natural, unforced grace. She approached the bench, took a pristine white napkin from her apron, and calmly wiped the blood from the ivory keys. She sat down. She adjusted her posture, rolling her shoulders back. In that moment, the timid maid vanished. Lucia Colombo became royalty. She raised her hands, and then she struck the keys. The sound that erupted from the Steinway was earth-shattering. Lucia did not just play the notes. She attacked them with a ferocity and precision that defied logic. The piece began as a low, ominous rumble, a violent tempest of bass chords that rattled the crystal chandeliers above. Her fingers, which Regina had mocked, flew across the keys with impossible speed and devastating accuracy. She navigated the erratic, maddening tempo with flawless grace, pouring years of hidden sorrow, anger, and resilience into every single measure. As the music swelled into its frantic, agonizingly beautiful climax, the entire room stood paralyzed. The hardened killers, the cynical bosses, the bleeding heiress on the floor, all were left utterly speechless. The music was a living, breathing entity, a dark romance of sound that perfectly mirrored the violence and passion of the underworld. Lucia's entire body moved with the rhythm, her curves swaying, her face flushed with exertion and pure, unadulterated awe. She was magnificent. She was a force of nature. Ettore Sacco stood paralyzed, his breath caught in his lungs. The ruthless armor he had worn his entire life cracked and shattered in the span of 3 minutes. He watched this beautiful, full-figured woman command the room with nothing but her bare hands and her unbreakable spirit. He didn't just want her. The monster inside him recognized its mate. He realized in that profound, echoing moment that he would burn the entire city of Chicago to the ground before he let anyone else ever speak to her, look at her, or touch her again. When Lucia struck the final, resonating chord, the silence that followed was heavier than a tomb. She sat there for a moment, her chest heaving, the last vibrations of the Steinway fading into the stormy night. She slowly turned her head to look at Ettore. Ettore walked toward her, stepping right over Regina as if she were garbage. He stopped the edge of the piano bench. He reached out, his large, scarred hand gently tracing the soft line of Lucia's jaw. He declared, his voice echoing through the silent, terrified room, that the challenge was over, and that the king had found his queen. The air in the penthouse remained entirely devoid of oxygen for the men and women witnessing the collapse of their criminal hierarchy. Ettore Sacco had spoken, and his word was an absolute, unyielding law. At his command, his elite guards swarmed the room. The East Coast bosses, recognizing the catastrophic shift in power and the immediate danger of Etor's unpredictable mood, scrambled toward the elevators like frightened sheep. Regina Renner was hauled to her feet by two massive Sacco enforcers. Blood dripped from her split lip, staining her designer gown. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She spat a stream of venomous curses, threatening that the Renner cartel would rain hellfire upon Chicago, that her father would slaughter Etor for this insult, and that she would personally cut the Curvy Maid to pieces. Etor did not even grant her the dignity of a glance. He waved his hand, a dismissive flick of his wrist, and the guards dragged the screaming heiress out of the penthouse. Etor remained by the piano, his imposing frame casting a long shadow over Lucia. He looked down at her hands, still resting near the blood-stained keys, and gently took them in his own. His touch was shockingly warm, a stark contrast to the cold monster the underworld knew. He traced the calluses on her fingertips, the physical proof of her lifelong dedication to her craft. He pulled her gently from the bench, his dark eyes sweeping over her full figure with a hunger that made her pulse race. He led her away from the grand room, guiding her through a set of heavy mahogany doors into his private sanctum, a massive library overlooking the churning dark waters of Lake Michigan. He closed the doors, shutting out the chaotic aftermath of the ruined parley. The silence in the library was intimate, heavy with unspoken tension. He directed her to a plush velvet sofa and poured 2 glasses of aged bourbon, handing her one. Etor finally demanded her story. His voice was low, vibrating with a possessive curiosity. He needed to know how a woman with the talent of a concert master and the spirit of a lioness had ended up scrubbing floors in a Mafia stronghold. Lucia took a steadying breath, the fiery liquid burning a path down her throat, giving her the courage to speak. She told him about Lorenzo Colombo, a brilliant but flawed conservatory instructor who had fallen into the grip of a severe gambling addiction. She explained how he had borrowed heavily from the wrong men to cover his debts, men who operated on the fringes of the Sacco syndicate. When he could not pay, he disappeared into the river, leaving Lucia to shoulder the impossible burden. She had taken the job as a maid at the estate, sacrificing her music, her pride, and her future to quietly pay off the men who threatened to finish off her remaining family. As she spoke, Etor's expression darkened into a terrifying mask of lethal calculation. He walked to his massive oak desk, picked up a secure encrypted phone, and made a single, brief call. He spoke only 2 sentences, identifying the loan sharks who had tormented her and ordering their immediate, permanent removal from the city. He hung up the phone and turned back to her, his eyes burning with a dark, obsessive fire. He told her that her debt was eradicated, erased from existence as if it had never been penned. Lucia stared at him, overwhelmed by the casual display of absolute power. She tried to maintain her composure, wrapping her arms around her waist in a defensive posture, suddenly acutely aware of her maid's uniform and the curves it struggled to contain. She whispered that she did not know how to repay him, that she had nothing of value to a man who owned the city. Etor crossed the room in 3 long strides. He knelt before her, a gesture of submission that would have sent shockwaves through the global syndicate. He reached out, his large hands resting on her soft, full hips. He looked up into her eyes, tearing down the insecurities that society and women like Regina had tried to weaponize against her. He told her that she was a masterpiece, a woman of substance, warmth, and devastating beauty in a world of starved, hollow ghosts. He declared that he did not want payment. He wanted her. He wanted the fire she poured into the piano to be his alone, and he would burn the world to ashes to keep her safe. Before Lucia could respond to the overwhelming confession, the heavy tranquility of the library was shattered. A blaring, mechanical siren ripped through the penthouse. The estate's perimeter alarms were screaming. The reinforced glass of the library windows vibrated as a muffled explosion echoed from the lower levels of the Sacco Tower. Regina Renna had not gone back to New York. She had come with a small army, and they were tearing their way up the building. The tender, vulnerable atmosphere vanished in an instant, replaced by the cold, metallic reality of Mafia warfare. Ettore was on his feet before the echo of the explosion faded, his posture transforming from a devoted lover into a lethal apex predator. He moved to a concealed panel behind a bookshelf, entering a rapid code. The wall slid away to reveal an extensive armory. He retrieved a heavy tactical vest and 2 automatic weapons, chambering rounds with a chilling, practiced efficiency. Lucia stood up, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The fear was entirely rational, yet as she looked at Ettore, the panic receded, replaced by the same fierce resilience that had allowed her to conquer the impossible piano challenge. She knew this building. As a maid, she had spent months scrubbing every hidden corner, every forgotten corridor, and every restricted access point of the sprawling Sacco estate. Ettore turned to her, his face a mask of cold fury. He ordered her to lock herself in the reinforced panic room behind the armory, swearing on his life that he would slaughter every Renna soldier and return to her. But Lucia refused. She stepped forward, her dark eyes flashing with defiance. She told him that Regina's men would be bottlenecked at the main elevator banks and the grand staircases, heavily fortified positions that would result in a massive loss of his men. She revealed the existence of a disused service shaft, a maintenance route she used for laundry transport, that bypassed the primary security checkpoints and opened directly behind the main defensive line in the lobby. Ettore stared at her, a profound sense of awe cutting through his murderous rage. She was not just a beautiful musician. She was a brilliant, strategic partner. He tossed her a small, compact handgun, telling her to keep it close and stay right behind him. They moved out of the library, navigating the darkened, smoke-filled corridors of the penthouse. The sounds of heavy gunfire and shouting echoed up the shafts. Lucia led him through the servants' quarters, pushing aside heavy linen carts to reveal a reinforced steel door. They descended into the bowels of the building, the air thick with the smell of cordite and burning drywall. When they emerged from the service shaft on the lower residential floor, they were perfectly positioned behind the Renna cartel's advance team. Regina's mercenaries, heavily armed and blinded by their own arrogance, were pouring fire into the main hallway, completely unaware of the threat at their backs. Ettore did not hesitate. He moved with a brutal, terrifying grace, unleashing a devastating hail of gunfire that decimated the rear guard in seconds. The element of surprise was absolute. Sacco soldiers, trapped in the hallway, rallied at the sound of their boss's counterattack, pushing forward in a brutal pincer movement. In the chaos of the shifting battle, Regina Renna appeared from a side corridor, flanked by her two last surviving personal guards. She looked disheveled, her designer dress torn, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate fury. She spotted Ettore, and then her hateful gaze locked onto Lucia, who was standing steadfastly behind him. Regina snatched an assault rifle from a fallen guard, screaming that if she could not have Chicago, neither would the fat maid. Regina raised the weapon, aiming directly at Lucia. Time seemed to slow down. Lucia raised her small handgun, her hands remarkably steady, a stark contrast to the trembling maid she had been hours ago. But before she could pull the trigger, Ettore moved. He threw his massive frame into the line of fire, taking a grazing shot to his shoulder without breaking his stride. He raised his weapon and fired a single deafening shot. The bullet struck Regina squarely in the chest. The cartel heiress gasped, the rifle slipping from her manicured fingers as she collapsed onto the marble floor, her tyrannical ambition extinguished in an instant. Her remaining guards dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, surrendering immediately to the undisputed King of Chicago. The heavy silence that followed was broken only by the groans of the wounded and the distant wail of police sirens that belonged to the syndicate. Ettore dropped his weapon. He ignored the blood seeping through his shirt and turned entirely to Lucia. He crossed the distance between them, pulling her into a fierce, desperate embrace. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling her scent, grounding himself in the reality that she was safe, that she was his. Lucia wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, holding the most feared man in the Midwestern underworld, as if he were the most precious thing in the world. As Ettore's surviving captains and soldiers gathered in the ruined hallway, they did not just look at their boss. They looked at the curvy, beautiful woman standing at his side, the woman who had conquered a madman's symphony and navigated them through a cartel siege. Ettore pulled back slightly, looking down into her eyes. He kissed her, a deep, branding claim in front of his entire empire, cementing the truth that the maid was gone forever, and the queen of the Sacco Syndicate had arrived. If you were captivated by this thrilling Mafia romance and want more intense stories of hidden strength, dark obsessions, and unexpected twists, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling us what you thought of Lucia's breathtaking piano performance and Ettore's ruthless loyalty, and share this video with your fellow romance lovers. Your support helps us bring more gripping, high-stakes underworld dramas to life. Thank you for listening.